Hi, folks. Pastor Mike Spalding here with my good friend and big brother.
I'm Pastor Casper, and we're here together to encourage you to keep listening to Deception Detection Radio, because we're both on this network with our individual shows.
Yes,
and
yes.
we're going to be doing some things together as well. Nudge, nudge, say no more.
Hey, folks, tune in Deception Detection Radio. Some of the best programming in Christian talk, news, encouragement, and Bible studies. God bless you.
God bless.
In the sky, gazing far into the night, I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through for you.
Welcome to Deception Detection Radio. I'm Kay.
And I'm Chad.
We pray you all had a blessed week.
Have you ever been afraid to open the door when you hear someone knocking and not know why? Or had the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you see some kids staring at you from across a parking lot? What would you do if you looked into someone's eyes and discovered they were coal black? No whites in their eyes, just black. Would you feel a scream trying to make its way up your throat? Or would your flight reflex take hold? Tonight we have author and researcher Nick Redfern joining us to discuss the Black-Eyed Kids. Well, welcome back, Nick. It's wonderful to have you join us again. How are you?
Oh, well, thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm doing good, thanks.
Good. Well, we're going to say the opening prayer, and then we'll get into it. Everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together tonight. Let us learn what you want us to learn and what you want us to hear. Please look after our audience that's listening. Put a hedge of protection around them. Put a hedge of protection around all of us, that nothing may interfere with what we're doing tonight, with the recording, anything. And once again, Father, thank you for bringing us together and allowing us to fellowship and to learn. And we pray this, Father, in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Well, Nick, since you've been here last time, you have released a couple more books. Would you like to tell us what you've been up to? And we're going to talk about the Black-Eyed Kids tonight.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the most recent book that I've had out in the last couple of months, Paranormal Parasites, which is a study of supernatural creatures, beings, entities that may feed on us, you know, instead of feeding on us physically, literally, but sort of draining us of our energies, our life force in sort of a parasitic fashion. And one of the subjects that I talk about in the book is the black-eyed children, because there's good evidence and data to suggesting that that's exactly what they do, that they sort of prey upon us in a sort of very sort of parasitic fashion.
Sorry, I had the mute on. That sounds really intense.
Well, it is. I mean, you know, everything about the whole black-eyed children phenomenon is very sort of weird and creepy and strange. I mean, they're called the black-eyed children because their eyes are quite literally completely black. And I don't just mean the center part of the eye is black. The entire eye is black, even the white part of the eye. And so that's why they become known as the black-eyed children. But there are also some other issues as well, where witnesses have described them as having very pale skin, in some cases almost like the color of a sheet of paper. And also witnesses have said that that their skin, not just their eyes, the skin kind of looks weird as well. It sort of looks like too smooth, almost like plastic. So they don't really come across, even though they're called the black-eyed children, they don't really come across as real children.
When did all of this start?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because sort of retrospectively, we have had, a number of stories come forward when people have said that, their grandmother or grandfather had a story like this way back in the 1920s or the 30s. But the stories only surfaced after the publicity was first given to the black-eyed children. So it's difficult to know for sure. But what we can say for certain is that the publicity given the subject on the internet started in the late 1990s. And it all began, largely at least, with a man named Brian Bethel. And his story surfaced in January 1998. Now, Brian Bethel was, and still is, a journalist who works out of Texas, and as a journalist for the Abilene Reporter News. And one particular night, he had to get out late. He realized he'd forgot to mail a check off. This was the days when people still use checks. And he realized he hadn't mailed his check off for whichever bill he had to pay. So what he did, he went to a local mall where there was a drop-off box, and it would go early the next morning. Well, as he pulled up and getting ready to write the check and deposit it in this drop-off box, he was suddenly aware that there were two children standing by the car. And it shocked him and surprised him mainly at first, because it was almost as if they literally appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't as if he saw them approaching the car sort of 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. They were literally there 1 second, after not being there at all. And he got this sort of very strange, eerie and chilling feeling from these two kids, and who basically wanted to get into the vehicle. And they mentioned this sort of weird line where they said that they could only enter the vehicle if it was okay with him to let them in, almost as if they had to be invited into the car. And of course, just the fact that they wanted to get in the car kind of creeped him out. What was the reason? And so he sort of kind of sat there dumbfounded as these kids tried to find every way possible to get into the vehicle. And at one point, Brian Bethel said that he actually felt as if his mind was being controlled and his self-will was being taken away from him, in the sense that he was telling himself in his mind not to open the vehicle door, but to his horror, he saw his arm moving towards the door as if it wasn't under his power, but it was under the power of the black-eyed kids. And he kind of pulled away at the last minute and jolted out of this state of almost like a supernatural hypnosis. And he hit the accelerator and fled the scene. But he said that the most terrifying thing of all was these sort of blank faces and these solid black eyes. And Brian put his story on the internet, and then other people came forward with their stories. So it kind of grew from there, really. But I think it's important, that the very first person to actually mention this had a very, respected background. He was, as I said, he was a full-time journalist for the Abilene Reporter News. And so that was one of the reasons why the whole issue really did begin and sort of kick off really quickly.
And I've also heard about their state of their clothes and stuff, that their clothes always seem kind of weird or awkward, like they're either out of the wrong time period, or just the stuff that they're wearing. Plus their vocabulary is another thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about, the way that they talk, like, "Hey, mister, it's almost dinner time. Can you let us in?"
Yeah, there's several things like that. One, as you mentioned, the clothing. Now, in most of the cases, the kids are sort of wearing these typical hoodies. But they pull the hoodies down as far as they can, sort of right down to their eyebrows and maybe a little bit further, probably as a means to try and mask and camouflage the eyes, because most of the witnesses say not only are they wearing these hoodies, but they're sort of looking at their shoes, so you barely get a look at them unless they sort of do happen to glance up, and that's when people see the eyes and the pale skin. But yeah, they also use a lot of weird phrases. There was one case, for example, where the black-eyed girl, instead of saying, "Can we come in?" she said, "May we come in?" And the guy afterwards said he thought that sounded like really old-fashioned style, you know what I mean, to say, "May we come in?" rather than "Can we come in?" And there are other cases where it's almost as if it's like a scripted statement, we need to come in, we're homeless, please let us in, we're hungry. Can we come in? We're lost and we need to phone our parents. And it's always putting the ball in the court, so to speak, of the person who's been approached. In other words, it's like the old vampire legends, where in those old stories, the vampire cannot pass the threshold, so to speak, until the person in the house lets them in. And that kind of parallels very much with the black-eyed children. They actually never force their way in, and they always try and get an invite, and they very often end up sort of frustrated and almost bordering on angry that the people won't let them in. And eventually they back away and they're gone, So they do seem to have their limits on what they can do. And bizarrely, it's almost as if there are rules that they have to sort of apply to.
Once they have made contact with someone, do they make repeat visits, or is it usually just one time and then they never appear again to that person?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because, some people might think that they do sort of target them over and again and, plague them and, endless stress and so on. But it's actually not that. There aren't many cases. In fact, I'm not personally of any cases where the black-eyed children put in sort of, second appearances at the front door, like a week later, and they're banging on the door again. Now, I have got some cases where in the aftermath of the visit, whether they got in or not, it was almost as if there was some sort of residual negative energy was left behind, where people talked about as soon as they were left, there was like a run of like electronic problems in the house, like microwaves exploded, refrigerators stopped working, things like that, as if, something had affected the technology in the house. Now, some of the witnesses did report afterwards sort of strange hang-up phone calls, which is all something that you get in a lot of the Men in Black stories as well. But I'm actually not aware, as I said, of any cases where, somebody got return visits, so to speak.
With the electronics being interfered with, doesn't that really point to it being something of spiritual nature, demonic?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting theory, because, there is this sort of theory, if you like, which believes that when people are seeing these black-eyed kids, that may not be their real form. It might be sort of like a deceptive image designed to sort of lure them to the door. I mean, if you think about it, sort of 10 or 11-year-old kids, they're not as sort of threatening or at all, versus a 6'5" guy who's outside your front door at midnight, So that's one of the theories, that, is there some sort of supernatural deception going on where these things that present themselves as relatively harmless kids, even though, there are certain things about them that don't look exactly right, to say the least. But yeah, I mean, there's numerous theories that have been put forward. You've got the demonic angle, the alien angle, alien-human hybrids, time travelers, all across the board, really. And 20 years after Brian Bethel's case, we're still really kind of scratching our heads.
Yeah, I know that even Jacques Vallée, That was one of the things that out of all the years of his research that he really started hammering on was that, even the whole thing with the aliens, that, they were basically masquerading as something else. He said that, they had been appearing, back in the olden times where, they were like fairies and dwarves and stuff like that. Then in another period, they were appearing as human beings, but they were saying that they lived in the clouds and they would fly around in airships. And then, now today, the most common is like the gray aliens and so on.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, there's no doubt that the UFO phenomenon has changed sort of radically over the last 70 years, where we had, well, before that, in the end of the 19th century, you had the phantom airships. Then in the 1940s, the Second World War, you had these strange balls of light that were known as the Foo Fighters, which is where the band gets their name from. And then in 1946, you had the ghost rocket sightings over Scandinavia. Then in 47, you had flying saucers. Now today, people talk less about flying saucers and more about these large, giant flying triangle-type craft. So the phenomenon has definitely changed over the years. And that goes to the creatures as well. Back in the 50s, it was the so-called Space Brothers, these so-called human-looking aliens with long hair. Then it was, the greys with the black eyes. Then the reptilians. So it's almost as if the phenomenon changes itself according to the cultures and the beliefs and the technologies of the people of that particular era. They're sort of trying to melt in with that particular, time frame in civilization as a means to present them as something which they may not actually be.
Did you ever research any of Carla Turner's research?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, that's interesting because, if you sort of go with the supernatural / occult angle, you can find a lot of parallels between alien abduction attacks and assaults and supernatural attacks as well. I mean, if you look at the abduction stories, the primary, or at least one of the primary aspects of the abductions is the genetic angle. The sort of the taking of DNA, cells, eggs, sperm, and so on. Well, you can go back 700 or 800 years, or even further. Ancient Babylonia, where they had like the incubus and the succubus and Lilith, this sort of beautiful-looking predatory woman who, in the old legends, would steal men's sperm to create this sort of offspring of demonic children. That's literally the story. Now, that sounds almost identical to what's going on in terms of the abductions, in terms of, the genetic angle, but also, a case has been made that, the demonic children of Lilith are today's black-eyed children, so you can actually, sort of put it together an intriguing kind of saga.
Yeah, and another interesting fact about these black-eyed children is that a lot of people who have encountered them, and we're talking, I know that one of the men that encountered them was a military man, and he said that whenever he looked into the eyes of that child, he said that the most horrendous fear came over him, and he said he was almost crippled, that the fear was so overwhelming.
Well, yeah, I think just about everybody who's seen or encountered the black-eyed children just gets this sort of terrifying vibe that things are just wrong, that it's kind of like that situation where occasionally, everybody meets someone for the first time. They don't know them, they know nothing about the history, but they just get kind of a vibe from them that there's something not quite right about this person. You don't want to spend time with them. That, we don't always get that a lot of the time, but you do get it sometimes. I mean, you don't know why, But yeah, I mean, that fear factor definitely comes into it. And it sort of ties in one of the theories as well, that they are able to sort of instill in us states of extreme fear, and then they kind of feed on these negative energies that our bodies are pouring out, and in other words, the threat and the fear angle may be kind of a ruse to place us into high states of emotion, which then gives them a greater ability to sort of essentially feed on us in a sort of a supernatural, parasitic way.
Nick, a lot of the people that have came in contact with them and have been the ones to invite them in have had extreme effects on their health. Could you talk a little bit about that too, please?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I would say a good 95, 96, maybe 97, 98% of the cases, the children have never been able to get into the house. The person's seen the face, the eyes, the strange skin, the fact that the skin is often like the color of a sheet of paper and so on. For the most part, they don't let them in. But on the rare occasions they have got in, the first thing that happens is that it's almost as if they're in a sudden daze, in a state of hypnosis. They're not entirely sure what's going on. It's almost as if they've been drugged, but not to the point where they don't fully know what's going on. It's just it's as if somebody had spiked the drink, that kind of thing, but they knew something was going on. And the witnesses who have actually been in the house with them have said that almost immediately they were overcome by this sense of like weakness and tiredness, and felt they could barely get off the couch because they just didn't have the energy or the effort to do that. It was as if they couldn't even barely think about sort of walking 10 feet across the room. It was as if they were pinned to the couch, not because they were literally pinned, but they just didn't have the energy to get off. And the kids were sort of staring at them in this vacant fashion, and the more they stared at them, the weaker and weaker the person got. And but that's just sort of the start of it. When they're fully, got their fill of the energy or whatever it is they need, they would then leave. But for the person, that would not be the end of it, because there's some cases where, say, for example, in the next day or 2 days afterwards, there's some cases where they had sudden, out-of-the-blue nosebleeds. Others were so weak they went to have a checkup at the doctor's and found that, their blood levels were off, and they developed anemia, and the doctors couldn't figure out how they. Just suddenly out the blue, healthy people were suffering from anemia. So there are a lot of things like that where, people do seem in some way to be being used in simple terms as a food source, which, for us, we don't think about that, because other than, somebody gets attacked by a lion in Africa or something like that, other than those kind of situations, we don't consider ourselves to be, the regular victims of a predator. But, maybe though that there are predators, that use us as a form of energy, but we just assume it's a bad dream, tied in with a dose of the flu that sort of, put your blood levels out or whatever. We just don't necessarily realize the bigger picture,
When I'd first started hearing about the black-eyed kids, it reminded me of the legends and folklore of vampires because of the effect that it had on people, the hypnotic state, the changes in the blood. It just seemed like it was a vampire in a different package.
Well, yeah, and I mean, then this sort of parallels the whole issue of how the UFO phenomenon has changed over the centuries, and, say the 1500s to now, you have fairies, goblins, the little people, things like that have changed in various ways as well. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, you look at the whole issue of the black-eyed children. I mean, they look sickly. They look like they need a meal. That's how actually one of the witnesses described it. They sort of sunken cheekbones, skin very pale and, sort of sickly looking. Typically skinny as well. They're almost always described as skinny. And you add to that this issue that they never find a way to get in. They always require an invite. As I said earlier, that sort of ties in with those old legends that the vampire can only come in when you invite it in, and then afterwards, if it wants to, it can come in again. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if, some of these legends of vampires 300 or 400 years ago could actually have been distorted tales of real accounts of early black-eyed children, or possibly even black-eyed adults, because there are a few cases of black-eyed adults as well. So, I think we could make a case that, the vampire legends may have been tied in with this, and the whole thing has become, combined into one.
Fascinating. What is the difference about the approach between the black-eyed children and the black-eyed adults? Because it seems like they would have to have a different approach for someone to notice them. I mean, a child approaches with childlike things.
Well, yeah, for the most part, in several of the cases that I've got, one of them came from a friend of mine, Denise Stoner, who's a MUFON researcher and has a long history working in the military, and a very grounded person. And several years ago, she had a very strange experience when the front doorbell was just ringing and ringing and ringing, and her daughter went to the door and looked through the spy hole, and there were these two strange-looking girls, sort of young, not young kids, but sort of teenagers, maybe a little bit more, and they both looked really weird. Their skin was pale, and they were wearing what were clearly black wigs in the form of like a bangs type style, so it sort of came down, like a, to the eyebrows and then around the face and so on. And they're both wearing these sort of oddly out of time clothes, which was like almost like an old overall that somebody might have worn, like 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, working around the house, like an old type overall. And but their eyes were solid black, and it caused a reaction into the family dog, which often occurs as well. Dogs seem to be aware, that there's something wrong about these children, and they just go into sort of a barking fit. And so that was one particular case. Now, what was really weird is that Denise's daughter did not want to open the door when she saw them through the door, and so when Denise went there, they were gone. There was no sign of them. No sign of them, walking away from the house. It was almost as if they'd materialized at the front door and had dematerialized at the front door. But it is interesting that for the most part, the black-eyed adults, if you like, never try and use that ruse, about our parents, obviously, because it would just seem strange anyway. But it just seems to be, more than anything else, they just sort of apply that sort of hypnotic state, if you like, into the person. And in some cases, they've just opened the door to them, and they've come in. And they haven't even used a line. They've just essentially sort of hypnotized the homeowner to sit on the couch. And then they go through the same process of sort of draining the person of energy. But for the adults, they rarely even say anything. They don't even bother with, sort of a cover story or anything like that.
I had a question that's a little off topic, but the whole, let's see how to word this, the abduction / poltergeist, I'm talking about the parallels between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you've seen a lot of in your research?
I wouldn't say a lot, but there's a lot of cases where paranormal activity does cross over into abduction cases, and also with sort of supernatural and occult cases. People find bruises on their arms, on their hands, on their wrists. In abduction cases, you get that in sort of paranormal attacks, supernatural attacks as well. Most abductions occur in the dead of night, as do most supernatural attacks. You have the sexual components of abductions, and you also get that particularly with these sort of demonic entities like the incubus and the succubus, these supernatural male and female entities. And of course, there's a significant degree of like an altered state of awareness and of even where this is going on. So, although a lot of UFO researchers who think alien abductions are just what they appear to be, they rarely, unfortunately, touch upon the parallels, the deep parallels that exist within, cases of demonic activity and supernatural activity sort of 500, 600, 700 years ago. But the parallels are so close, and there are some cases as well where, for example, people were visited by the Men in Black, not the sort of Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones types, but the sort of pale, weird-looking MIB that John Keel talked about. And the number of the witnesses said they experienced violent poltergeist activity in the home after the Men in Black had left. Now, of course, poltergeist activity surfaces in, paranormal cases, never mind just Men in Black cases. So there's no doubt there are a lot of parallels and events and issues that mirror something else. It's just to what extent, the belief system of this researcher or that one prevents them from sort of looking into other areas because they just don't want to deal with things like that sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, because the whole movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you remember the scene where the kid's in his room and the toys start coming alive and start moving around.
Oh, yeah.
The screws start coming up out of the vent and the floor and everything, and it's like...
Yeah.
I'll never forget. It's like, once I started doing a lot of, research or whatever stuff, one day I just happened to be watching it. I was like, wow, I never realized just how demonic or, supernatural that's almost like a poltergeist, Yeah,
it is. And I think the problem is so many people who are just driven by the sort of nuts and bolts, flesh and blood, alien angle, like someone else's equivalent of NASA coming here and that's all it is. People who just focus on that, unfortunately, they don't really appreciate a lot of the deep similarities that you can get in just about every supernatural aspect or phenomena that's out there, and I think if people would look further into some of the more supernatural aspects, they might see their minds starting to change a little bit in terms of what they're actually dealing with. Is it extraterrestrial? Is it multidimensional? Is it supernatural? We don't know, but I mean, I think it can't hurt to sort of, open your horizons and not just focus on what everybody was talking about way back in 47, 48,
With everyone that has been approached by the black-eyed children, were there any things in common between the people, or were they from all walks of life? Did they share anything?
Well, I don't want to, sort of say what I'm going to say now applies to everybody because it doesn't. But what I can tell you for sure is that I would say at least 20% of the cases that I've got of the black-eyed children knocking on the door and so on, of that 20%, I would say around about that figure. The situation is that the people who were visited at some point in their past had dabbled in the occult or the paranormal. Now, I need to sort of stress that by also saying that, the overriding majority, like 80% or whatever, had no interest or involvement in the paranormal, but roughly about 20, 1 in 5 thereabouts actually did. And in some cases, it was sort of like using Ouija boards, sort of actually getting, in several cases, getting really deeply into the world of the occult. I know, for example, one guy who had an experience and a visit, like 2 days after he started getting into the writings and the books of Aleister Crowley. Now, those cases, as I said, are not the majority. They're not even 50%. They are around about 20%, I'd say. But, when you're sort of dabbling or digging into the paranormal, supernatural, and it's not necessarily completely clear to you, it's a new issue, and you sort of open doors and call things through, well, it's like you can make a good argument that it's easy to open a door, not quite so easy to sort of close it behind you, So there is that aspect, which I think, definitely could do with sort of additional further research. What were the people doing in the days, weeks before they had the visit? And maybe, we might see something come out. Now, what I have found is that several of the people I spoke to who had been sort of digging into the paranormal and dabbling with it, at first didn't want to admit it. They basically said, no, nothing weird. And then the more we got chatting, they were like, well, okay, we feel a bit more comfortable talking now. And yes, there was something like a month ago. We hung out with friends, we played with a Ouija board and whatever. So, and then things started to come out, you know what I mean? So, so I think that angle of, as I said, wondering or focusing on what the people were doing, not after the event or during it, but in the build-up towards it, that might actually open a few people's eyes, possibly.
That was a good question, Kay.
Thank you. I'm just sitting here wondering that they have been involved, the 20% may have been involved with anything occult. Now, the 80%, were any of them that you're aware of, were any of them Christians? Did they invoke the name of Jesus, like a lot of the abduction stories that we hear, that if they say the name of Jesus, then that entity disappears?
I haven't personally come across that angle, but, it's possible. I mean, for example, I know David Weatherly, who's, the leading expert in this field. I mean, I've got sort of dozens of cases. David's got like hundreds. So it's possible. I haven't personally got anything that sort of that goes down that path. No.
Because I had never heard of that because I've heard about the black-eyed children for years and done research on it, but I had never heard from that point of view that anyone had messed with anything occult. That's really fascinating. It just goes to show what you think is a toy is not a toy.
Well, yeah, I mean, a perfect example, and again, another one that a lot of people don't necessarily know of. If you go back to the early 1950s, Albert Bender, who was the first guy really to bring the Men in Black phenomenon into ufology. This was sort of 1952, 53. And Bender had this group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He lived in this old house in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And he was visited by these three shadowy men in black, almost like today's shadow people, as they're called, who sort of psychically threatened him and warned him to leave the UFO subject alone or else. Now, that's the stories it's largely told. What a lot of people don't know was that, like in the 2 years leading up to that, as I said, he lived in this old house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, but Bender lived in the attic room of this house, and he created what he called a supernatural altar. And he was very like an expert person when it came to understanding the history of ritual magic and things like this. And he, as I said, he created this supernatural altar, which is his own words, and tried to, sort of perform a ritualistic act as a means to call forth supernatural beings. So I don't think it's a coincidence that just a couple of years later, these sort of supernatural, dangerous shadow people, where they seem to be dressed in like like a black suit and a black fedora and this pale skin. I think there's a direct connection there, so that's sort of a parallel, like figures in black, like the black-eyed kids, coming into the house. In this case, they supposedly literally sort of materialized through the walls and the doors. And it was all due to the fact that that Bender had been messing around, and opening things that he wasn't able to shut, until he walked away from it. That's the important thing. He dropped everything, walked away, and the rest of his life was fine. He never came back to ufology, and he only died 2 years ago at the age of 94, so there's like a lesson to be learned there,
Yeah, very much so. I would have ran, not walked. Chad, did you have something that you wanted to ask?
Well, he's also going to talk about alien abductions. He's got another book coming out about alien abductions.
Ooh.
So
something else up our alley.
Yeah, and there was definitely one thing I wanted to ask you about, because there's movies like The Fourth Kind, and there's a book called Messengers. I'm talking about the owl /
Mike Clelland's book.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that, because that's another thing that I've had people ask me about.
Well, yeah, this is one of the interesting aspects of ufology that very often went sort of under the radar, so to speak, for many years, possibly decades, until the sort of 1980s, late 80s, when people like Whitley Strieber and other researchers, John Mack, started to make an association between alien abduction cases, missing time, and owls. And the reason why the owl, well, there's actually several reasons why, but in many of these cases, people would be driving home late at night, and when they got back home, there's sort of 3 or 4 hours missing. They couldn't figure out what had happened. The journey should have only taken an hour and a half, and it took sort of 5.5 hours. And then they started to have sort of negative dreams and nightmares. And in those nightmares, they would often see, they were driving down the road, and they would see this owl about sort of 4 to 5 feet tall, which is basically impossible, to have an owl that big. They're just, in history, in zoology, there's nothing like that. And they couldn't figure out why they just drove past this huge owl and went home, and afterwards they're like, well, why didn't I stop? Anybody would stop if they saw something like that. And the more stories that surfaced, it was almost as if, the owl image was sort of like what's known as a screen memory, to hide what really happened. For example, screen memories can occur when someone has a really traumatic event. Say, for example, you're walking down the street and 2 cars collide at sort of 70 miles an hour, and people are sort of thrown through the windshield 40 feet across the road and they're killed. Sometimes a screen memory will actually blank that out, and all you'll remember seeing is perhaps the cars hitting each other or approaching each other, and then you cannot remember anything properly. It's all a blur, and it's basically the mechanisms of the mind do that to protect you from sort of ongoing trauma. And so that's kind of what some researchers think are going on, that these entities, whatever they are, they can sort of create an image in the human mind. Oh, it was just an owl and nothing else. And people think, over time it's like, well, yeah, that was an odd-looking owl, but it was just an odd-looking owl, and they move on with their lives. So, you have that theory that the owl imagery is created as like a screen memory to hide the abduction. But in saying that, if you look at Mike Clelland's books, The Messengers, and his follow-up books as well, which are really good books, Mike sort of started off, with that angle of alien abductions and a cover story and cover images for something else. But the more he dug into it, he found a lot of stories where people who had been abducted and had these weird encounters with owls, that somebody in the family, like a close relative or a friend, would die, or they'd have an experience, and then there would be this owl just sitting outside the window, late at night, and the people would get this creepy vibe that it was like an omen to something. And then they found, that someone had died as well. And it was almost as if that there's some sort of connection between this owl imagery, the abductions, and sort of fate and life and death and things like that. And it gets into some really unusual categories and situations, if you like.
Yeah, I know that a lot of the Native Americans, they associate any kind of imagery or visions or dreams of owls with death. And another thing, let's see here. Another thing I wanted to ask you, out of all your research, that movie, The Fourth Kind, whenever they are regressing people through hypnosis and stuff like that, like the one scene in the movie where they're regressing him and the guy literally levitates off the bed. Has there been any stories like that you've run across, actual stories?
I'm not personally aware of something where that had actually happened. But I mean, there are a lot of cases where people have said that in an abduction experience, they felt like, they felt, they were being taken from the bed, and, somehow their body has passed through the walls or the ceiling and then, literally passes through the walls of the UFO. So there are cases, not so much, where the person's levitating like in the movie, but it's more along the lines that that's what they remember in this sort of strange, almost dreamlike state that they're plunged into. And there are a few odd cases where people have been taken on board UFOs and they see themselves looking down from the ceiling of the UFO, and they see their body laid out on the table as if somehow these entities have extracted the soul of the abductee and separated them so they can actually see their physical body in the craft, while their sort of discarnated soul, however you want to term it, is looking down at the person with the so-called greys standing around them, on like a table or a platform.
With the research that you've done, do you lean more towards aliens being demons or aliens being extraterrestrials?
Well, I mean, when I was a kid, it was all sort of black and white. I thought it was just aliens coming from this star or that star, but I kind of sort of grew out of that. Certainly when I was time in my early 20s, I was sort of thinking, well, there's parallels here that we should look into more. This just sounds too weird to be just aliens, and certainly, by the time I was in my 30s, I won't say I'd given up on the extraterrestrial angle, because I hadn't, and I haven't fully given up on it now. But I think because there are these sort of stranger aspects to all this, and the parallels and crossovers with the occult and the supernatural, I'm inclined to think that these things are probably not extraterrestrial, but sort of multi-dimensional. Now, one person might say, like, a dangerous multi-dimensional entity is a demon. Somebody else might say, a dangerous multi-dimensional entity is something we don't fully understand, but it's something that has the ability to cross over from its reality into ours, but it's hostile to us. So, I don't have a firm opinion on what they are, but I think whatever these things are, they have the ability and the potential to be very dangerous, manipulative, and they will sort of torment people and put them into situations which just create sort of like the world's worst Monday morning for you, where people just have bad luck and ill health and all sorts of weird things that happen that you would just not imagine would be possible for one person. So I think whatever, one religion might call them demons, a person who doesn't buy into the demonic angle, but they might still say, yes, these things sort of coexist with us and they're extremely dangerous and we need to avoid them. There's not really much difference, I guess, other than the person's core belief system. But yeah, I mean, I do believe whatever the phenomenon is, the UFO phenomenon is. I do believe it's real. I think it's probably not extraterrestrial. I think it's manipulative, potentially dangerous, and it requires us to have sort of almost like a relationship with it to allow them to interact with us. It's like making making a supernatural pact. That when you made the pact, they've got the person in their claws, so to speak.
Well, speaking of interdimensional beings with the ability to basically cause people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, that also applies to Bigfoot. And you being a cryptozoologist, I know that you know where I'm going with this. And that's another weird fact that I hear a lot of people talking about these things popping up around UFOs as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of weird Bigfoot stories out there. Now, the vast majority of Bigfoot cases are of people seeing what looks like a large ape in the woods and the forests, and, it's there in sight for a few seconds and it races off or vanishes into the trees. Most of the reports do fall into that category and don't have sort of weird aspects to them. But there is, a smaller category where people claim to have seen a Bigfoot creature, and it's quite literally vanished in front of their eyes. It's literally gone. Other cases, it's vanished in sort of a flash of light. There have been reports of people seeing strange lights flitting over forests and woodland, about the size of anywhere from a tennis ball to a basketball. And then suddenly these lumbering, large ape-like creatures come lumbering out of the woods. A friend of mine, Stan Gordon, did a lot of research into cases in the 1970s in Pennsylvania, and he wrote a really good book about it called Silent Invasion, which is a study of sort of all the weird paranormal activity that went on in relation to Bigfoot in Pennsylvania in the early 1970s. Now, those cases are interesting and they do intrigue me, but there's no doubt that they do equate to the minority of cases. So we need to sort of keep an open mind on what this means or what it doesn't mean. But at the very least, I think there's something to do with Bigfoot that goes far beyond at least than it just being like a North American equivalent of like an African gorilla. I don't think it's that simple. Now, maybe it's that these creatures just have the ability to sort of scramble with our minds. I mean, one of the theories is that Bigfoot uses infrasound almost as a weapon. Infrasound is a very low frequency sound wave that some animals use to contact others. But it's such a low frequency sound that some low frequencies can actually disturb the human nervous system. So one of the theories is that perhaps these Bigfoot creatures have the ability to use infrasound, which sort of briefly scrambles the mind of the witness, and they think the creature vanishes when it's actually, their mind is distorted for a few seconds or so to allow the creatures to get away. But from the person's perspective, it almost looks like magic, So, but I do think there's more to the phenomenon than we're seeing right now, and I think that probably explains to some degree why they're so elusive. Something that's 8 foot tall, living, all across the United States, because they've been reported in every state apart from Hawaii. We should really have one by now. I mean, we're talking about things that are like 8 feet tall. We should at least have one body, I think, by now. But yeah, there's definitely, if you buy into that angle of Bigfoot, there definitely are some really strange stories out there.
Yeah, I've heard some people talk about their eyes glowing, and also stories of people losing time that have encountered them that, looked into their eyes. So that's why, that plus with them popping up around UFOs, it's like, what's up with that? It's like there's too many coincidences popping up in here.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, the one person, I guess, who really kicked that off the Bigfoot angle more than anyone else would have been John Keel. I mean, he drew parallels with how, there'll be a UFO wave in one little village, and then it suddenly comes to an end. And then in another little village, Bigfoot's running around, and then it's suddenly gone, And and he sort of drew parallels between, some of these supernatural creatures of the past and so-called monsters of today, and how they were always elusive, how they would be here one second, gone the next second, tied in with these strange lights in the sky, never able to catch them, and Keel did make a good case, but he also made a lot of enemies, because on the one hand, the ufologists hated him because he was saying this probably isn't extraterrestrial, and the cryptozoologists didn't like him because he was saying that, Bigfoot was essentially supernatural. So, but he, to his credit, Keel stuck to his guns and said, well, this is what I think, and here's the evidence. You can either like it or not like it. And I think that's what people actually did. They took him at his word. Like it or don't. So.
Yeah, it's rather interesting. Did you want to jump in, Kay?
No, he's covering everything. One of the cases that has always got my attention, and it was one of the first ones I'd ever heard, was Betty and Barney Hill.
Oh, yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating. Now, in your research, have you found any more people that have been given something, or they have taken something from the entity that has taken them, like they did with Betty Hill? They took it back, but they did initially give her something, which is the Zeta star map.
Oh, the map, you mean? Yeah. Well, yeah. In the Betty and Barney Hill case, for people who don't know, it occurred in September '61 when Betty and Barney were driving home from late at night from a vacation in Canada, and they saw at one point this strange light in the sky that didn't seem to be operating like a regular aircraft, and didn't know what it was. Got back home, started to have these weird dreams, nightmares of stopping the vehicle and being taken on the board the craft, and both of them being subjected to medical experimentation and investigations. And it caused them quite a bit of trauma, to the point where Barney actually developed serious stomach ulcers, and he died young. He was just a young man when he died from brain hemorrhage. So, definitely had a bearing on all this situation. But, when the Hills were on board the ship, they claimed that they were shown this almost like a map, but weirdly, almost like, this sort of simplistic map. I mean, you don't imagine aliens would need a large paper map to negotiate the stars, It was almost like a symbolic kind of imagery, as I sort of see it. But anyway, this angle that you mentioned about, for example, how people tried to take things from the craft and always being thwarted from doing it, that often pops up in a lot of old folklore and myths and legends of fairies, where somebody's walking through the woods and they see these strange lights, which were known as fairy lights back then, which you could attribute as UFOs today, and they would be taken to the fairy kingdom, where the man would have sex with the queen of the fairies, because the fairies, their race was dying away. And that's just like, what we hear in abductions, that the greys are on like an evolutionary decline, and so they use our DNA to sort of beef up their species. But on that other angle, there are a lot of cases where people allegedly taken, to the world of the fairies, and they tried to bring back a souvenir with them, and every time they tried to do it, it would either get left behind, or it would dematerialize in the hand, or it would just sort of melt away and vanish when they got back to our world. So there is that angle throughout, the little people of ufology and the little people of, sort of goblins, fairies and so on, where, you do have these parallels of the technology, or these magical realms where you just cannot penetrate them and bring anything back. It's almost as if the witnesses are being toyed with and played with, at the very last minute, they snatch it back.
Almost like, well, we'll let you have this, but you have to do this. And then they'll let you, but they'll still take it back.
Yeah, it's very often like that. That it's like there's always like this to and fro where you do something for us, we'll do something for you. But it rarely is in our favour. You know, it's always we always come away kind of the victims.
What do you make of the stories of the women that say that they have came back pregnant, but they haven't been with a human man, that it belongs to an alien, and just before it's time for them to give birth, the baby disappears? Have you researched any of those stories?
Well, yeah, I mean, some researchers call those missing fetus syndrome, where, you know, the baby seems to be developing fine, and then it's gone, and there doesn't seem to be, you know, like a tragic situation, you know, like a failed pregnancy and a miscarriage or anything like that, and you know, so for that reason, I mean, you know, the whole thing is a very traumatic situation for the person. But I mean, people like Bud Hopkins had collected cases like that and talked about how, you know, women who perhaps had an experience with a UFO lost a baby, not a miscarriage, not an abortion. It was just there, and then it wasn't there. It's hard to say because the stories like this are so controversial, but also, you know, they're very sort of, I guess, emotionally draining, you know, for the people. So I think, you know, you really have to sort of tread carefully with these stories because of, you know, the sheer level of emotion that can come out. But I mean, all I can say for sure is that, you know, there's the phenomenon has been sort of recognized in terms of that there are, you know, people who think that's exactly what's going on. Personally, I've not investigated any cases like that, but I've read about them.
Yeah, there's definitely something going on that it deserves to give it attention and a lot of discernment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's when you start dealing with things like that, you know, missing babies and missing children, I think, you know, a lot of people don't dig into it purely and simply because it goes beyond just investigating UFOs, but it moves more into, you know, dealing with people whose lives have been sort of torn apart and where you really need, you know, sort of medical experts, you know, psychologists, etc., who are really the best people to handle a situation like this, rather than ufologists who may not actually have any training, you know, to deal with someone who's had such a traumatic experience as that, you know.
This may sound crazy, but are there psychologists, doctors out there that deal specifically with this issue?
Not really. I mean, for example, I mean, John Mack would be the perfect example of someone who did do that, you know. And he sort of really went out on a limb, you know. I mean, he was a major figure at Harvard. And when he sort of turned his attention to alien abductions and writing about the subject and researching it and, you know, also talking about the soul being extracted from the body, I mean, a lot of his colleagues basically gave him the cold shoulder, you know, for good, just shunned him. And you know, one of these, he just demonstrated how, you know, the mainstream world really just will not deal with this kind of thing. And even if you've got friends and colleagues for years, you know, they'll sort of, you know, just want very little to do with you. I mean, that happened to John Mack, you know, so many times. So now there may well be, you know, privately, people similar to Mack who possibly share his own beliefs, but having seen what happened to him, that may well sort of resulted in them being silenced because, you know, they looked at their career, you know, their funding for next year's, for whatever, you know. So I think for that reason, there probably are a lot of people who, it wouldn't surprise me if there are a lot of people who have, you know, sort of respectable jobs, careers in, the medical community, the world of religion, and so on. But they just don't want to talk about it. They just want a quiet life because they saw what happened to John Mack,
I had a question, or wanted to bring something up. There was a female researcher out there that was doing DNA testing on Bigfoot hair, and I cannot think of her name to save my life right now, but I remember one of the things that she did was she took some Bigfoot hairs as well as alien abductee hairs, and she had did that, that Raman spectroscopy, where they can see if there's any similarities or whatever stuff. And I remember, if I remember correctly, they tracked identical, the Bigfoot hairs as well as the alien abductee hairs, and that was intriguing. But there's another gentleman out there by the name of L.A. Marzulli. I'm not sure if you're familiar with L.A. He does the Watcher series, and has several books on the Trail of the Nephilim and stuff. In fact, him and his wife Peggy's house just burned to the ground out there in the fires out there in California.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, they've got a GoFundMe page where if anybody's interested that would like to help them out, you can find their GoFundMe page, and you could send some money to them to help them out. But he also did one similar to that, where he took a regular human hair, he took a dyed hair, then he took a mummy hair from one of the elongated skulls down in Paracas, Peru, as well as a UFO abductee hair. And the only two hairs that tracked identical was the elongated mummy hair as well as the alien abductee hair. And that reminded me of that whole thing about the lady that was a Bigfoot researcher who had done something similar with a Bigfoot hair and an alien abductee hair.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that lot, any of that, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I would say is that if we're going to get the answers to these phenomena, we are going to have to sort of look at things in an alternative way, because just collecting cases and stories isn't really going to cut it. We do need someone to go out on a limb and look at things from an alternative perspective, because the regular perspective, if you like, isn't really giving us more answers. It's just giving us more, collecting more stories, which is fine. But on the other hand, we need to get beyond just collecting stories and accounts. We need to try and figure out how we resolve them, or can we even resolve them?
Well, also, like the elongated skulls, they always want to bring up the whole thing about cradle boarding, and that's fine. I mean, yes, some of them are, skulls that people did things to alter them and try to make them look a certain way. But the thing is the ones like down in Paracas, Peru, and other places, and this is a worldwide phenomenon. They're not in just one particular area. That they've found these elongated skulls all over the entire planet. But the thing about these is that they don't have a suture. They're missing a suture. And on top of that, they have two holes in the back of the skull for blood vessels. So, I mean, that clearly, it's like we knew something was up, and they kept trying to say, well, these are just human skulls that they cradle boarded or did this. Well, no, that's not true. There's distinct, differences between them. And then finally, they did the DNA results on these elongated skulls, where they, went down there. It was Marzulli and Joe Taylor and Brian Forrester and all them, and they actually took, bone samples and sent them off and had DNA tests done on them, and they finally came back and said, look, these things are not completely 100%, Homo sapien or whatever. It's like they're part human but not completely human.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really, dug into the elongated head stuff at all. I mean, I know what it is, but I haven't done any research in it at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like I said, this stuff all is, tied together, especially with the alien and, like I said, Bigfoot and everything else. It's like it's all tracking in the same direction. It's just a lot of people, they just kind of gloss over it.
Yeah.
But yeah, did you? Is there anything in particular you wanted to hit on your alien abduction book that you said you got coming?
Well, yeah, I'll sort of give you some background on it. It's actually just come out. It came out on November the 1st, and it's called Top Secret Alien Abduction Files. And it's actually a study of what's known about the abduction phenomenon by government agencies. And I was able to get hold of a number of declassified files on abduction cases, which demonstrate interest going back to the late 50s, early 1960s. And, hopefully people will find it sort of intriguing, because although a lot of books have been written on abductions, the whole angle of government files on abductions is one that's sort of rarely, if ever, touched, So, but, it's intriguing. It was intriguing even for me, to find actually how many abduction cases did attract, the attention of the intelligence community and so on, who, it seems, really don't know too much more than we do. We expect agencies of government to have all the answers, but it seems almost as if, they know something's going on, but to a significant degree, they're sort of scratching their heads in the same way we are, which is sort of an interesting aspect. You don't necessarily think that would be the outcome of it,
Yeah, there's quite a bit of overlapping in there. I know that one of the things that blew my mind, we did a lot of research for the Hollow Earth film that me, Justin, and Wes did, and, we got all into Admiral Byrd, but one thing I was unaware of at the time was that Admiral Byrd's nephew was part of Majestic 12, and that he had actually wrote a foreword for the book Stranger at the Pentagon.
Oh, that's the Frank Strange's book, the Valiant Thor one, that one.
Yeah, and like I said, that was Admiral Byrd's nephew, who was part of Majestic 12, who wrote the foreword for that book.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to be honest again with the elongated heads. I really don't know much about the Admiral Byrd story. I guess it's, for me, doing the books and whatever, there's only so many hours in the day, I guess, So.
Well, he was part of the Operation High Jump, where they actually went down to Antarctica.
Oh, yeah.
And while, like I said, he came back and okay, are you all right? Okay, I think, she probably really...
I'm here.
Okay, I didn't know if you unmuted because you were wanting to jump in or something.
No, it's good. Go ahead.
Okay. But, yeah, the whole thing about the Operation High Jump, Forrestal was also part of Majestic 12, and that whenever they got back from the Operation High Jump, that they basically Forrestal became real loose-lipped and was talking about what had happened down there in Antarctica. And then next thing you know, they got him checked into Bethesda mental hospital. And then all of a sudden, he was talking while he was in the hospital to some of the nurses. And next thing you know, he nosedived 16 stories out the window. And all his diaries and everything disappeared, and that right after that, then Admiral Byrd kind of clammed up, and he wasn't really talking about things. But then years later, after he had passed away, then the whole thing about Admiral Byrd's diary came out, and it talked about what he had encountered whenever he was at one of the poles at one point.
Yeah, I mean, Forrestal's death was a very, very strange one. He was not the sort of person you would think who would sort of, throw himself to his death from, the Bethesda hospital. But, it was as if he went from being just, regular guy in government to then suddenly, becoming this person who was living in fear and terror and paranoia that he was being followed and watched and... just a very, very, very weird and tragic story. Yeah,
because he was Secretary of Defense at one time as well.
He was actually the first U.S. Secretary of Defense, and before that he was a Secretary of the Navy during the Second World War. So he was someone who had the ability to operate, under stressful situations. I mean, Secretary of the Navy during the Second World War, but then something weird happened, and his mind just sort of swung completely, 180 degrees, so to speak.
Yeah, it's all very, very interesting. Like I said, especially when you start seeing these things all clicking together. But that like I said, that's what threw me. It's like I was aware of Stranger to the Pentagon, the whole thing about Valiant Thor and all that. I mean, it's very interesting. But like I said, whenever I found out that was Admiral Byrd's nephew and that he was part of Majestic 12, it's like, okay, again, it's just too many, similarities here and too much stuff overlapping.
Well, you do find a lot of overlaps, in certain phenomena. Some you don't, but I mean, as I said, things like the parallels between the Men in Black and the Black-Eyed Children are so close. The issues of the incubus and succubus of 1,000 years ago are really no different at all to today's abductions. So if people look, they'll find that, you know what I mean? But the problem is very often belief systems sort of cloud just like a rational approach, So I think that sometimes hinders the research.
It's never a dull world, that's for sure.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Oh, well, I think this is a good place for us to stop tonight. And Nick, you said you will come back and we will discuss Slender Man in the future.
Yeah, I'll be pleased to. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
Love to do that. And Chad's going to go ahead and do the closing prayer, but before he does that, can you please let people know how they can get a hold of you and where they can get your books?
Yeah, sure. Well, all the books are available on Amazon, and around about 2/3 of them you can get off the shelves in Barnes & Noble. And I have a blog where people can reach me, which is called World of Whatever. Or people can also reach me at Facebook. Send me a message, and if people have got questions or they need any help or they just want to share a story and to try and get an opinion on what happened to them, I'm always happy to take time to speak to people and try and help them out or give advice if I can.
He also does a lot of articles for Mysterious Universe.
Yeah, that's right.
Very busy man.
Well, it's people that say that, but I only sort of work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday writing. I like to take evenings off and I take all weekends off. That way I don't sort of get burned out. So I just like to work, on the books and the articles. I like to sort of keep what I call work time, like 9 to 5, and then 5 o'clock comes around, laptop goes into sleep mode and it stays there till like 9 the next morning, and on a Friday it's shut down at 4. I don't touch it again till Monday morning. So.
That's wonderful. You can do that.
Yeah, I'm good at sort of switching on and switching off.
Gives you a good chance to get refreshed too.
Well, yeah, it lets me have a normal, a normal life as well as an alternative life as well, I guess.
Awesome. Well, Chad, will you please go ahead and say tonight's closing prayer?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
Father, thank you for this evening, for this wonderful fellowship with Nick and him to come on and share his research and his years of information that he's been working on. We hope that everybody who's been listening to this, we hope that they found it informative as well as edifying. And we thank you for everything that you do in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chad. Well, that's going to do it for tonight, everyone. We want to thank you for tuning in, and we pray that you all have a blessed week. Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
In the sky, gazing far into the night, I raise my hand hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through.